Hi, let's learn in this Lightboard session how to establish private connectivity for the Azure AI services by using Azure API Management, Front Door, and Private Link Service. The objective here is that we keep the resources private. It means that they will be accessible only through private endpoint, and the only public exposition will be done through the Azure Front Door that will provide protection with Web Application Firewall WAF, and also it would have a global reach or global point of presence. So typically organizations that uses AI services to create the LLM models and consume them, they will use multiple instances either to enhance the resiliency and the high availability of their apps, or just to resolve the limitation issues for the PTUs available within each region. So these resources are by default publicly exposed to the internet through a public FQDN, but we can privatize those resources and use a private endpoint instead. So here, if I have a virtual network, a VNet here, and then inside, if I have like here a subnet, then what I can do here is that I can disable the public endpoint or the public network traffic for each one of these AI services and establish here a private connectivity through a private endpoint. So each one of these services would have a private endpoint that will be injected into the subnet. That private endpoint is the one that will provide connectivity to the AI services. Then we would use Azure API Management in order to consume those services. So Azure API Management will be also available and injected into its own subnet. So here also it means that I would have subnet for the API management. And yes, here I would have my Azure API management resource. And because this API management resource is injected already into the subnet, so it would have access to those private endpoints. So directly here, it can actually do access to those endpoints. And through using the policies from the GenAI, you can create priority and wait for each one of these endpoints so that the load balancing will respect that policy. So now for API management, especially the V2 with the standard V2 here, that's the one I'm targeting in this architecture. It would have by default a public exposition. So it would have a public FQDN that will allow users to connect to that Azure API management. But here we don't want to expose it publicly. We want to add more protection through the firewall. So we can disable that public network traffic for the Azure API management, and Azure Front Door will still be able to connect to it. So if I have here an Azure Front Door, the Azure Front Door here will be the entry point or will be the public endpoint for my customers or for my client applications. So they will connect to the front door, and then through the front door, we'll be able to connect to the Azure API management. But how that connection will happen? That will be established actually thanks to a new feature available within the Azure Front Door for the origin, where it can use private link service to connect to the Azure API management. When we enable that feature, what will happen behind the scenes is that a private endpoint for the Azure API management will be created within a VNet. Actually, this is a VNet that does not belong to the customer, but this is Microsoft managed VNet. And the Azure API management would have a private endpoint that will allow it to access, and Azure Front Door, by using the private link service, will be able actually to access to that private endpoint. So it's like we are providing Azure Front Door access to that VNet and then access to that private endpoint that will allow it to access the Azure API management. Great, what's now if I have here a workload within this virtual network and I want to consume from this internal workload, like a virtual machine, for example. How can I from this Azure VM consume this Azure API management? So in this case, actually, I need just to create a second private endpoint. So APIM here have one private endpoint for the front door, but here we'll need a second private endpoint, which will be injected here into the subnet of the Azure VM. And then through that private endpoint, this Azure virtual machine will be able to access that Azure API management and then access those Azure AI services. Now, because we are using those private endpoints, so we need to be able to resolve the FQDN and the URLs for those private endpoints, and that will be done through using the Azure private DNS zones. So here, actually, we should have private DNS zone. Actually, you would have multiple ones, one for the APIM and the other ones for the Azure AI services. Great, so that was how we can keep all of these resources private and only accessible publicly through an Azure Front Door. Thank you.